Thank you so much for allowing me to join your very important summit remotely. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you. And I should say at the outset that I am not an expert in the technology side of things, particularly around the very important subject of direct air capture. What I wanted to try to do was to offer a strategic context within which the case for, the arguments for, the details on DAC and carbon dioxide removal could be expressed. And that strategic context, I think, is very important. So let's start where we are. We are, according to the WMO, likely to pass 1.5 degrees on at least 1 year in the next few years. Second, emissions are still not falling. Third, we're keenly aware now with the work of the IPCC of the dangers of exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade, and indeed, of course, there's very severe dangers of exceeding 2 degrees centigrade. And we know logically from the science that net zero is a necessary condition for stabilizing concentrations and temperature. If you put all that together, it's crystal clear that carbon dioxide removal and direct air capture within that story is an imperative. And I think we should also remind ourselves that unless we go quickly in showing that this can be done, it is feasible and it can be done at reasonable cost, unless we can do that, we risk the whole challenge of rather more sinister forms of geoengineering. We also know, and this is the second conclusion, that it's the whole path that matters, not just the net zero at 2050. So we're going to have to move very strongly and very quickly on decarbonisation. These two things work together, the CDR and DAC on the one hand, and the decarbonisation on the other. And we also note that probably it will not be that fast to get to CDR on scale, and that further underlines the importance of very strong action on decarbonisation now. Now, as we think about that whole story, we've got to be clear about the world's objectives. The world's objectives are Paris, including, of course, well below 2 degrees efforts for 1.5, but they're also the Sustainable Development Goals. What we're trying to put together as we decarbonize here is a whole development story, which is involving mitigation, carbon reduction, but also involving resilience and adaptation, and indeed natural capital. So much of what we have to do has to be seen in that overall context. And CDR and DAC will flourish best if that context is embraced and welcome. And that includes, of course, the natural methods of removal around mangroves, restoring peatland, restoring degraded land, more generally, afforestation, and so on. So that's the basic scientific and global context for all this. So with that, let's turn to CDR and DAC themselves, and particularly comment on scale, method of removal, and cost. First, on scale. If you look at the work of IPCC and UNEP, it's pretty clear that over the course of this century, whatever you assume about scenarios, we're likely to have to remove over the century around 500 gigatons of CO2, quite probably a bit more if we do not decarbonize at the rate that we should. And if you look at the flow rate of that, how much we're likely to need carbon dioxide removal each year, by the middle of the century, that's likely to be at least 5 gigatons per year, more likely something like 10 gigatons per year. So that's the scale that we have to think of if we look at the temperature targets that we've quite rightly set and the possible flows of emissions taking into account policy. So that's the likely scale. If you think of 10 gigatons per year at a price of $100 a ton, that's $1 trillion. If you think of 5 gigatons a year at a price of $200 a ton, that's $1 trillion. There are various ways of thinking about that, but it does seem to me that an overall scale of the market of $1 trillion a year by mid-century is really quite likely. So that's the scale on which we have to act. So let me suggest 5 policy measures in order to finalize what I want to say. First, given the dangers and urgency, we have to look across all the methods for carbon dioxide removal, within which, of course, direct air capture is of special importance. Now, my good friend Julio Friedman is the place I usually start in trying to be informed about different methods. I won't go over them in any detail because I know that Julio is speaking to you. But we have to look across them all, and my first policy recommendation would be a systematic assessment of the different methods, including, of course, their physical constraints, their costs, and in particular also, very relevant for direct air capture, the permanence and the confidence in additionality. So there are various criteria for assessment. Cost is just one, but it's an important one, but there are others too, and physical constraints would be a very big part of that. And as I said, permanence and additionality. So let's produce, as a world, a systematic assessment of where we are now. Number 2, we're going to need research and development across the whole range of possibilities, including direct air capture, but also algae and BECCS and soils and so on, and all the ideas on offer. And I do meet enthusiasts for all of these, and their case is often quite strong. We need R&D across the board. Third, we need support for going to scale, because we've already recognized just how big that has to be, and that's going to involve very substantial international public funding in the billions or many billions in order to support going to scale. Fourth, we must keep pushing for high carbon prices, at least $100 a ton very soon, and rising from there. Fifth, we have to begin international discussions of how a future industry which will be, as we've remarked, in the scale of many hundreds of billions or trillions, how that can be financed at a global level. By mid-century, that might be 0.5 percentage point of world income. A modest price, I think, for the kind of security that it would bring and the kind of catastrophe it would avert. But those monies have to be raised, they have to be raised internationally. And my own view is that some kind of tax on international transport, sea and air and so on, would be one of the possible sources. So in conclusion, let's be clear that there are 2 big statements to make. We have to drive emissions down, and if we do that well, with the right kind of investment, that will be the growth story of this century. But it's crystal clear that we will also need carbon dioxide removal, and within that, direct air capture will play a major role. We have to start preparing for that right now.